If you talk to any behavioral economist anywhere in the world, and you ask them what their typical day looks like, most would tell you that they spend a fair bit of time in a lab like this one. I'm standing at the entrance to the behavioral lab at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. In fact, doing experiments in a lab is almost the bread and butter of the existence of any behavioral economist. All of the great theories you've heard about, all of the cool phenomena that you've read about, were all born in a lab like this one. But what exactly is a lab, and how does a lab function, and what is an experiment? To find out more, we'll talk to Julie Huang, who is the manager of the lab at the Rotman School of Management. Julie, what exactly is an experiment?
Well, an experiment is basically a tool that researchers can use to establish whether or not there's a causal relationship between one particular variable and an outcome that they care about. And in experiments, the outcome that they care about is called the outcome variable. It's also known as the dependent variable sometimes. And the factor that researchers are interested in seeing whether or not it has a causal relationship on the outcome variable, that's called the independent variable. And at its most basic, all experiments compare two groups, the treatment group and the control group. And typically a researcher will deliberately vary or manipulate the presence of the independent variable between these two groups. So in the treatment group, all participants will experience the independent variable. In the control group, the independent variable will not be present. And then the researcher will compare both groups' responses on the outcome variable. And there's lots of different kinds of experiments that can be run. There's natural experiments. So in these cases, researchers, instead of deliberately manipulating the independent variable, they'll just look in the world and find naturally occurring groups that just happen to differ based upon the variable of interest. In lab studies, what we can do is we can bring participants into the lab. We'll randomly assign them to either the treatment group or the control group, and then we can really tightly control their experiences. And we can make sure that the control group and the treatment group only differ based upon the independent variable.
What are the kinds of things that researchers would typically manipulate in an experiment in a lab like this one?
Well, there are lots of things that can be manipulated in a lab like this. Basically, from the second that a participant shows up for a study, the researchers can change something about their experiences. You could embed the manipulation into the instructions that they receive. You could embed it into the experimental materials from the font that, you could vary the font that they do the surveys in. You could even change the participants' surroundings, insert subtle changes in a laboratory just like this one. So in this lab, we have temperature control systems. So you could even, if you had a prediction about, say, how temperature affects people's ability to cooperate or compete in a prisoner's dilemmas game, you would just have people, you would only manipulate the temperature of the room. So you could have the temperature be really cold or just normal room temperature, and then you just compare these two groups on the level of cooperation. But they're just really, you can really manipulate a lot about participants' experiences according to your independent variable of interest. And I think it's really open to researchers' imaginations and creativity, how they want to manipulate participants' experiences. And the one thing about the advantage that we get from these lab settings is that basically researchers can tightly control conditions such that they're only manipulating one and only one factor, and they can basically hold all other factors constant.
Tell us about one of your own experiments, something that you would consider perhaps a favorite experiment. What were you looking to study, and how did you plan out the whole thing?
I'm currently in the area of consumer behavior, so I'm very interested in what makes people willing to pay for certain items. And in one of my recent studies, I was interested in whether or not incidental feelings of disgust could decrease people's willingness to pay for objects that had been previously owned by other people. And I was also interested in seeing whether or not people who felt disgust would be equally disgusted by objects that had been owned by their friends versus by strangers. And so basically this was a two-factor experiment. We had people who were induced to feel disgust or not, and we had people who rated objects that had been used by either strangers or friends. And so basically what we did is, before all participants come into the lab, we'll flip a coin. The first flip, they'll decide whether or not they receive the disgust manipulation or not. And the second flip will determine whether or not they rate a product that they're then told belongs to their friend or stranger. And so when they come in, we give them a cover story about, we tell them that they're rating products, they're rating logos, things for a consumer study, just making general consumer evaluations. Then we basically have them rate the logos. Some of the logos are disgust related for those who are in the treatment condition. For those who are in the control condition, they're not disgust related. Then we show them a screenshot from Amazon.com. We just pilfered it from Amazon.com, and we changed everything except for we told people that this product was being sold by their friend or by a stranger, and we asked them, how much are you willing to pay for this? And participants would write down an exact dollar amount, how much they valued that object, and then we would then compare these four groups.
Could you show us a couple of interesting rooms in this lab?
So sometimes researchers will want to get participants to sample food items or beverages, and that's why we have a space like this, the kitchen, where people can store the materials for those studies. Now, I know, Dilip, you've popped a lot of popcorn in this room. This is the control room where the research assistant running the experiment sits and manages the experiment.
So as a research assistant, my role is to ensure that all the procedures and protocols by the researcher is followed completely. I know how many conditions there are for experiments, and I randomly assign participants to those conditions. However, I don't know the exact rationale or the goal behind each conditions or the overall objective of the study.
Experiments in which the data collection is done by a computer are done in rooms like this one. One of our PhD students, June, is getting ready to run an experiment.
In my experiment, I have two conditions. Everybody reads the same information, but in this condition, the screen appears in a font that is easy to read. But here, in the second condition, the screen appears in a font that is difficult to read.
Now that we've seen the insides of a lab and we know what experiments are, it's time for us to open the hood and take a closer look at the design of experiments.